see. I have to turn this light on. Oh, okay, good. Yeah, so I'm going to be addressing some philosophical and conceptual questions to the new happiness research. And I'll begin with two quotations. The first is from a poem by Wordsworth, which is called The Character of the Happy Warrior. He begins the poem by saying, "Who is the happy warrior? Who is he that every man in arms should wish to be?" The second is from Nietzsche. Nietzsche says, "Man does not strive after happiness, only the Englishman does that." Psychology has recently focused attention on subjective states of pleasure, satisfaction, and what is called happiness. The suggestion has been made in some quarters that a study of these subjective states has important implications for public policy. Sometimes, as in the case of Martin Seligman's positive psychology movement, attempts are made to link the empirical findings and the related normative judgments directly to the descriptive and normative insights of ancient Greek ethics and modern virtue ethics. At other times, as with Daniel Kahneman's work, the connection to Aristotle and other Greek thinkers is only indirect, and the connection to British utilitarianism is paramount. Nonetheless, judgments are made that I think could be illuminated by an examination of the rich philosophical tradition that runs from Aristotle through Jeremy Bentham and Mill's criticism of Bentham. The aim of this talk is to confront this increasingly influential movement with a range of questions. Often these questions have a very long history in philosophy, going back at least to Aristotle. The more thoughtful utilitarians, and above all Mill, also studied them in depth. Some of these questions are conceptual and others are normative. After going through a number of these, I'm going to suggest some useful roles for subjective state analysis to play in public policy. So first, conceptual issues. Number one, what is pleasure? Psychologists often talk about pleasure and about subjective hedonic states. Too rarely, however, do they ask some very obvious questions about it that greatly affect any research program involving the concept. The central questions are, is pleasure a single thing, varying only in intensity and duration? Or is it plural, containing qualitative differences? And is it a sensation, or is it something more like a way of attending to the world, or even a way of being active? Bentham famously held that pleasure was a single sensation, varying only along the quantitative dimensions of intensity and duration. Modern psychology, on the whole, follows Bentham. But is Bentham right? Does his account correctly capture the complexity of our experience of pleasures of many sorts? We speak of pleasure as a type of experience, but we also refer to activities as my pleasures, saying things like, my greatest pleasures are listening to Mahler and eating steak. We also use verbal locutions, such as enjoying and taking delight in. The ancient Greeks actually used such verbal locutions far more often than the noun. Such ways of talking raise two questions. Is pleasure a sensation at all, if such very different experiences count as pleasures? And is it single? Could there be any one thing that both eating a steak and listening to Mahler's 10th Symphony produce, that harrowing confrontation with grief and emptiness? These questions were subtly discussed by Plato, and then Aristotle and a whole line of subsequent philosophers. Bentham simply ignores them. As Mill writes in his great essay, Bentham failed in deriving light from other minds. For Bentham, pleasure simply must be a single homogeneous sensation containing no qualitative distinctions. The only variations are quantitative. Pleasures can vary in intensity, duration, certainty or uncertainty, propinquity or remoteness, and finally, in causal properties, such as the tendency to produce more pleasure. The apparent fact that pleasures differ in quality bothered Bentham not at all. Perhaps the reason for this problem is that Bentham's deepest concern is with pain and suffering, and it's somewhat more plausible to think of pain as a unitary sensation varying only in intensity and duration. Even here, however, differences seem crucial. The pain of a headache is very different from the pain of losing someone you love. As Mill says, Bentham's view expresses, quote, the empiricism of one who has had little experience. Either external, he says, going out in the world, or internal through the imagination. Nor was Bentham worried about interpersonal comparisons, a problem on which economists in the utilitarian tradition have spent a great deal of labor, and one that any program to use subjective satisfaction for public policy must face. For Bentham, there just was no such problem. When we move from one person to many people, we just add a new dimension of quantity. What is appealing about Bentham's program is its focus on the urgent needs of sentient beings for relief from suffering, and its determination to take all suffering of all sentient beings into account. But Bentham cannot be said to have developed anything like a convincing account of pleasure and pain, far less of happiness. Because of his strident simplicity, the view remains a sketch crying out for adequate philosophical development. Modern philosophers, starting off from the Greco-Roman tradition, have noticed that already in that tradition, there's a widespread sense that Bentham's type of answer will not do. A proto-Benthamite answer is familiar in views of hedonists such as Eudoxus and the title character in Plato's dialogue Philebus, who represents Eudoxus's position. But there's an equally widespread sense among the Greek thinkers that this view is not correct. The young interlocutor Protarchus in the Philebus is quickly brought by Socrates to reject it. He sees that the sources of pleasure color the pleasure itself, and that the pleasure of philosophizing is just not the same thing qualitatively as the pleasure of eating and sex. The name Philebus actually means a boy lover in Greek, and it's clear that Philebus is trying to represent his pleasures as the central cases to which all pleasure is assimilated. Aristotle takes up where the Philebus left off. Throughout his work, he insists on the tremendous importance of qualitative distinctions among the diverse constituent parts of human life. He later suggests that these distinctions affect the proper analysis of the concept of pleasure. Notoriously, however, he offers two very different conceptions of pleasure, one in Book 7 and one in Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics. In Book 7, he identifies pleasure with unimpeded activities. And that's not so odd if we remember this fact that we talk about enjoyments and pleasures. The second, and probably, I think, more adequate account of pleasure in Book 10 holds that pleasure is something that comes along with or supervenes on activity, like, he says, the bloom on the cheek of youth. In other words, it's so closely linked to the relevant activities that it can't be pursued on its own as a separate thing any more than the bloom on the cheek of a healthy person could be pursued apart from health. To get that bloom, you've got to pursue health. Similarly, one gets the pleasure associated with an activity by doing that activity in a certain way. Apparently, it's a way that is not impeded or is in some sense complete. It would seem that what Aristotle has in mind is that pleasure is a kind of awareness of one's own activity, varying in quality with the activity to which it's so closely linked. In any case, pleasure is not a single thing. It contains qualitative differences related to the differences of the activities to which it attaches. Mill follows Aristotle. In a famous discussion in utilitarianism, he insists that, quote, neither pains nor pleasures are homogeneous, end quote. There are differences, quote, in kind, and he italicizes that, apart from the question of intensity. And these, he says, are evident to any competent judge. We can't avoid recognizing qualitative differences, particularly between what he calls higher and lower pleasures. How then to judge between them? Mill refers us to a competent judge who has had experience of both. This famous passage shows Mill thinking of pleasures as very like activities with Aristotle in Book 7, or perhaps with Aristotle in Book 10 as experiences so closely linked to activity that the two cannot be pursued apart. In a later text, he counts music, virtue, and health as major pleasures. Elsewhere, he shows that he has not left sensation utterly out of account. He refers to, quote, which of two modes of existence is the most grateful to the feelings, end quote. Clearly, however, the unity of the Benthamite calculus has been thrown out to be replaced by a variegated conception involving both sensation and activity, and prominently including qualitative distinctions. Modern philosophical discussion of pleasure follows Aristotle and Mill. In one of the best recent accounts, J.C.B. Gosling's book, Pleasure and Desire, Gosling investigates three different views of what pleasure is: the sensation view, the activity view, and what he calls the adverbial view, that is, pleasure is a certain way of doing something. That's, I think, closely related to Aristotle's second view of pleasure. And finally, uneasily and with much uncertainty, he opts for that third view, the adverbial view. Now, it's obvious that such debates affect the way in which one would study pleasure empirically. If Aristotle, Mill, and Gosling are correct, it would not make sense to ask people to rank all their pleasures along a single quantitative dimension. This is just bullying people into disregarding features of their experience that reflection would quickly reveal. People are easily bullied, particularly by prominent psychologists, and so they do answer such questions, rather than responding, "Your question is ill-formed." If Mill and Aristotle are right, however, they would quickly agree on reflection. The qualitative distinctions do matter. Moreover, any experiment that simply assumes pleasure to be a hedonic state, something like a sensation, would also be inadequate to the complexity of human experience, since people agree that activity matters. They would not think that the pleasure derived from being plugged into Robert Nozick's famous experience machine, which gives you the illusion that you're being active but you're not really doing anything, was equivalent to the pleasure associated with really doing the activity itself. Second conceptual question: what is satisfaction with one's life as a whole? Some of the most influential experiments ask not about pleasure or hedonic flow, but about satisfaction with one's life as a whole. Typical is the question posed by Daniel Kahneman, quote, taking all things together, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole these days? So it's present tense. Are you very satisfied, satisfied, not very satisfied, or not at all satisfied? Notice here the bullying we encountered before. People are simply told that they are to aggregate experiences of many different kinds into a single whole, and the authority of the questioner is put behind that aggregation. There's no opportunity for them to answer something very ordinary and plausible, such as, well, my health is good, my work is going well, but I'm very upset about the Iraq War, and one of my friends is very ill. Not only is that opportunity not offered, but in addition, the prestige of science and indeed of the Nobel Prize itself is put behind the instruction to reckon up all life elements as a single whole. The fact that people answer such questions hardly shows that this is the way they actually experience their lives. If we bracket that difficulty, however, we arrive at another one. There's a deep ambiguity about the question being asked. The psychologists who pose this question take the question to be a request for a report of a subjective state of satisfaction, which is at least close to the feeling of pleasure. Kahneman treats the question and the hedonic flow question on the whole as different ways of getting at the same thing. One might indeed hear the question that way, but one might also hear it in a very different way, as a request for a reflective judgment about one's life, which judgment might or might not be accompanied by feelings of satisfaction, contentment, or pleasure. Consider the last words of John Stuart Mill, "I have done my work." Now, I would say that this is in one way an answer to the overall satisfaction question. Mill is reporting, we might say, satisfaction with his life as a whole. He has done what he aimed to do. And yet, it seems highly unlikely that Mill, on his deathbed, suffering from great physical pain and from the fear of death that he acknowledges, not being able to get rid of as a result of the fear of losing forever his connection to Harriet. It's very implausible then that Mill is experiencing feelings of satisfaction or pleasure. He once reports that the great attraction of a belief in life after death, which he finds himself ultimately unable to accept, is the hope of being reunited, quote, with those dear to him who have ended their earthly life before him, end quote. A loss, he continues, that, quote, is neither to be denied nor extenuated, end quote. So he would no doubt be struggling on his deathbed with the eternal loss of Harriet in addition to his own demise. While judging that his life is on balance successful, he is almost certainly not experiencing feelings of satisfaction or pleasure. Since the psychologists who work on this question do not notice this ambiguity, they do nothing to sort things out. So we really don't know which question the subjects think they're answering. Probably, some are answering one question, some the other. In my own case, the ambiguity produces something like a contradiction. That is, my own conception of a good life attaches a great deal of value to striving, longing, and working for a difficult goal. So, if I ever notice myself having feelings of satisfaction, I tend to blame myself and think that insofar as I have those feelings, I'm like Mill's pig satisfied or Aristotle's dumb grazing animals, and thus, reflectively, I report dissatisfaction with my life as a whole. Nor do I think that I'm an unusual case. Mill's contrast between Socrates, dissatisfied, and the pig satisfied reveals similar values. And anyone whose culture is deeply influenced by Romanticism, with its exaltation of longing and yearning, would have the same difficulty. Insofar as one is feeling satisfied, thus far one's life is not a success. That is what Nietzsche is getting at in my quote. Having feelings of satisfaction as a goal, he thinks, is a rather low-grade thing, something that he associates with the impoverishment of English culture by contrast to the richness of German Romanticism. Zarathustra, his character, asked whether he is happy, responds, quote, "Do I strive after happiness? No, I strive after my works." Schiller, Beethoven, and Mahler might have said that they were satisfied with their lives as a whole in the reflective judgment sense, but they probably would not have reported many feelings of satisfaction, and they would have worried about themselves if they had had such feelings. Next conceptual question, what is happiness? Bentham simply identifies happiness with pleasure. Kahneman, on the whole, agrees with Bentham. Some psychologists are more subtle. Martin Seligman has a conception of authentic happiness that involves both positive emotion and valuable activity. But, to return to Socrates and the pig, how are these two constituents related? Are they both necessary for happiness and jointly sufficient? Is one more important than the other? And must the positive emotion be suitably linked to the good activity, a kind of taking delight in one's good activity? Well, Seligman doesn't tell us, but here's what Aristotle thought. That activity is far and away the main thing, and that pleasure will normally crop up in connection with doing good activities without struggle, the way a virtuous person usually does them. Pleasure accompanies activity and completes it, he says, like that bloom on the cheek of the youth. That example implies, too, that it would be totally mistaken to pry the pleasure apart from the activity. And Aristotle also thought that sometimes the pleasure actually won't be present. For example, he says, the courageous person who is virtuously facing the enemy in battle and knows that he's about to lose his life is happy because he's doing the virtuous activity, but he has no pleasure because he's aware that he's losing everything. Wordsworth's very Aristotelian poem, from which I quoted before, The Happy Warrior, tells a similar tale, describing the happy warrior as happy simply because he is active in accordance with all the virtues, and yet it's clear in the description that he has little, if any, pleasure and a great deal of pain. Wordsworth is a useful interlocutor at this point because we can see that the Aristotelian idea of happiness, namely that it's primarily virtuous activity, was dominant until Bentham's influence dislodged it, changing the very way that many people Here the English word, happiness. So powerful was the obscuring power of Bentham's oversimplification, that a question that Wordsworth takes to be entirely askable, that is, who is the happy warrior, and which indeed he spends 85 lines answering, the question, namely, what happiness really consists in, soon looks to philosophers under Bentham's influence like a question whose answer is so obvious that it can't be asked in earnest. Thus, the early 20th century philosopher Henry Pritchard, albeit a foe of utilitarianism, was so influenced by thinking about happiness in the utilitarian way that he simply assumed that any philosopher who talks about happiness must be identifying it with pleasure or satisfaction. When Aristotle asks what happiness is, Pritchard argues, he can't really be asking the question he appears to be asking, since the answer to that question is obvious. Happiness is pleasure or satisfaction. Instead of asking what happiness is, then, Aristotle must really be asking about the instrumental means to the production of happiness. Nietzsche, similarly, understands happiness to be a state of pleasure and contentment and expresses his scorn for English culture who pursues that goal, rather than richer goals involving suffering and striving. Apparently unaware of the richer English language tradition about happiness represented in Wordsworth's poem, Nietzsche simply took the English word happiness to be what Bentham said it was. Aristotle's richer conception is still present in our lives, and we can see that ideas like Seligman's idea of authentic happiness capture something of its spirit. According to this Aristotelian tradition, what we can all agree about is that happiness, and I must say that I don't use even the English word when I write about Aristotle because I think it is so obscured by now. But so from now on, I'll also use the Greek word eudaimonia. So the eudaimonia is something like flourishing human living, a kind of living that is active, inclusive of all activities that have intrinsic value, and complete, meaning lacking in nothing that would make it richer or better. Everything else about happiness is disputed, says Aristotle, but he then goes on to argue for a conception of happiness that identifies it with a specific list of valuable activities, including activity in accordance with various capacities of many different types. And this is really the root of my own conception in the capabilities approach. Something like this is the idea that Wordsworth is relying on when he asks in each of the many areas of life what the character and demeanor of his happy warrior would be, and then answers that question. As philosopher J.L. Austin memorably wrote in a devastating critique of Pritchard on Aristotle, quote, "I do not think Wordsworth meant this is the warrior who feels pleased. Indeed, he is," and then he quotes from Wordsworth, "doomed to go in company with pain and fear and bloodshed, miserable train," end quote. As Austin saw, the important thing about the happy warrior is that he has traits that make him capable of performing all of life's many activities in an exemplary way, and he acts in accordance with those traits. He is moderate, kind, courageous, loving, a good friend, concerned for his community, honest, not excessively attached to honor or worldly ambition, a lover of reason, and an equal lover of his family. His life is happy in the sense that it is full and rich, even though it often may involve pain and loss. So, would Seligman agree with Aristotle and Wordsworth that the happy warrior is indeed happy, or does he require pleasant emotion in addition to the activity? If even Seligman's conception is underspecified, however, Kahneman doesn't get to the point of even noticing a problem. He simply goes along with Bentham. When we notice that happiness is complex, we're prepared to face a yet further question in connection with its proper analysis. Does happiness require self-examination? All the ancient philosophers take issue with popular accounts of eudaimonia in their cultural setting by arguing that no life is truly eudaimonia unless it's accompanied by reflection. As Socrates says in the Apology, the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. One sees clearly in Plato's dialogues how controversial this emphasis is. When people are asked to define a virtue seen as a putative part of happiness, They never include the element of knowledge or reflection until Socrates patiently shows them that any definition that leaves that out won't do, even by their own lights. On reflection, they always agree with Socrates, and I would say that most of my contemporary students do too, when they think about it for a while. Aristotle gives a little more room than Plato does to the non-reflective elements in virtue, but he too sticks to the Socratic commitment, saying that each and every virtue requires the intellectual element of practical wisdom. Much later, of course, Mill insists that it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than the pig satisfied. The commitment to reflection is also a commitment to the ceaseless critical scrutiny of cultural beliefs and cultural authorities. Socrates interrogates everyone he meets, and nobody does very well, especially not receive cultural authorities. Socrates himself does better only in the sense that he's aware of the incompleteness and fallibility of his own knowledge of eudaimonia. Although later Greek philosophers are more willing than Socrates to give some definition of what eudaimonia is, they are no more trustful of their culture. All are relentless critics of their culture's dominant understandings of happiness. The omission of this reflective element is one of the most disturbing aspects, I think, of the conceptual breeziness in contemporary subjective state psychology, insofar as it's laying the groundwork for normative political recommendations. Our democracies have many of the vices Socrates identified in his own case: haste, macho posturing, and excessive deference to wealth and honor. We badly need the element of critical reflection. And if prestigious psychologists simply tell us again and again that reflection is not a necessary element of the happy life, we may begin to believe it. And last conceptual question, which emotions are positive? The part of subjective state measurement that focuses on moment-to-moment hedonic flow assumes that some emotions are positive and others are negative. Seligman makes a similar assumption and tells us a little bit more about what he is assuming, in keeping with his rather greater interest in philosophy. For Seligman, positive emotions, to put it somewhat crudely, are the ones that feel good. So love would be positive, anger would be negative, grief would be negative, and so on. The ancient thinkers adopt a very different answer. Again, this issue deeply affects any normative recommendations that may ultimately be based on the conceptual assumptions. Since the Greeks and Romans, along with the best work on emotions in contemporary cognitive psychology, believe that emotions involve appraisals or evaluations of things in the world, they think it's very important for these appraisals to be correct. Fear, for example, involves, in Aristotle's view, the thought that there are serious, important damages impending, and that one is not entirely in control of warding them off. Anger, again in Aristotle's view, involves the thought that a serious and inappropriate damage has been willfully inflicted on me or someone or something one cares about, and also the thought that it would be good for that damage to be made good somehow, made up for. So we can see that there are a number of things that can go wrong here. One might get the facts wrong, thinking that a danger was present when it was not, or that a wrong had been done when it was not actually done. One might blame the wrong person for the wrong, or one might wrongly believe that the damage was blameworthy when it was in fact accidental. Finally, one can get the seriousness of the good or bad event wrong. One may get angry over trivia. Aristotle's example is people who get angry when someone else forgets their name. So we can see the world hasn't changed very much in some thousands of years. Or again, another Aristotelian example, you might be afraid of a mouse that runs across the floor. But again, he thinks that's just silly. Because emotions embody appraisals, one can only get them to be appropriate by getting the appropriate appraisals. So, in the Rhetoric, Aristotle gives the aspiring orator recipes for producing anger in the audience. For example, by convincing them that their enemies have wronged them in some inappropriate way. And also recipes for taking anger away and calming people down by convincing them that they had not, in fact, been wronged in an inappropriate way. For all the ancient thinkers, a necessary and sufficient condition of an emotion's being truly positive, in the sense of making a positive contribution towards a flourishing life, is that it be based on true beliefs and correct appraisals. This is as true of good feeling as it is of bad feeling emotion. Many instances of good feeling emotion are actually quite negative, inasmuch as they're based on false beliefs about value. Pleasure is only as good as the thing one takes pleasure in. If one takes pleasure in harming others, that good feeling emotion is very negative. Even if one takes pleasure in shirking one's duty and lazing around, that's also quite negative. If one feels hope, that emotion is good only if it's based on accurate appraisals of the worth of what one hopes for and true beliefs about what is plausible. By the same token, many negative feeling emotions are actually quite appropriate and make a good contribution to the flourishing life. Aristotle, like Wordsworth, stresses that the courageous person is not free from fear. Indeed, he will appropriately feel more fear and pain at the prospect of losing his life than the mediocre person, because his life, which is at risk, is a valuable life, and he knows it. Anger is a sign of what we care intensely about, and a spur to the pursuit of justice. Aristotle does not urge people to be angry all the time. Indeed, he thinks that the appropriate virtue in this area might well be called mildness of temper, in order to indicate that the good person does not get angry too often. But if somebody did not get angry at damages to loved ones or kin, he is, in Aristotle's words, slavish. And again, there are other painful emotions, such as compassion, which are extremely valuable. That is to say, they're based on true beliefs and accurate evaluations of the seriousness of the other person's predicament. They connect us to the suffering of others and give us a motive to help them. Daniel Batson's contemporary research on compassion underlines the connection between the pain of compassion and helping behavior. The ancient philosophers also stress that happy and sad emotions are conceptually interconnected. To the extent that you value uncertain things that are in the control of fortune, you can't help having both fear and hope about them, since their prospects are, in fact, uncertain. Where you have love, you will also have anxiety, and very likely you'll sometimes have anger. Where you have gratitude, when someone does something importantly good for you, there's also the conceptual space for anger, if that other person should turn around and do something bad to you. The Stoics saw clearly that the only way to get rid of the bad emotions was not to value the uncertain things of human life at all, and to care only for one's own inner states. But Aristotle and most modern readers of the texts reject that solution. I think Aristotle here is correct. That is, emotions are positive or negative in the sense of making a good or a bad contribution to the flourishing life according to the correctness of the appraisals or evaluations they contain. And since human life contains, in fact, many bad accidents and much bad behavior, there's no way a person who values friends, loved ones, work, and political action can avoid having many painful emotions, such as grief, fear, and anxiety, and even anger. These emotions are valuable as expressions of correct evaluation and also as spurs to good action. Can one imagine a struggle for justice that was not fueled by justified anger? Can one imagine a decent society that is not held together by compassion for suffering? Can one imagine love that does not assume the risk of grief? Seligman, in particular, thinks that it's good to promote good-feeling emotions and to minimize bad-feeling emotions, often by thinking hopeful thoughts. But sometimes having a hopeful take on the bad thing that has happened seems to trivialize it. The Stoics urged people to respond to the death of a loved one with constructive thoughts, such as, everyone is mortal and you'll get over this pretty soon. But are they correct? Is this really the way to take the measure of a deep love? It's very interesting to see how Cicero, whose voluminous correspondence consoled his friends with all those positive sentiments and told them to think hopeful thoughts, rejects them utterly when his beloved daughter Tullia dies. Among the most moving letters in history are his outpourings of desperate grief to his friend Atticus, to whom he says that he feels like he's wandering in a dark forest, and whose injunctions to put an end to his mourning he angrily rejects, saying that he can't stop grieving, and moreover, he thinks he should not, even if he could. Today, Americans are often embarrassed by deep grief and tend to give a stoic type of advice too freely. A colleague in my university lost his son, a troubled young man, who died either from suicide or from a drug overdose. I wrote him saying I thought this was the worst thing that could happen to someone and that he had my sympathy. This man, whom I don't know very well, wrote back immediately, thanking me and saying, I really dislike this American stuff about healing. And he is an American. I inferred from that many other messages he had received had talked about his, let's hope you heal soon, and so on, and he had gotten fed up with that. I'm with him. It seems a deeply inappropriate way to think of the tragic death of one's own child. So I'd like to see psychology think more about positive pain. That is, the grief that expresses deep love, the fear that expresses a true sense of a threat directed at things one values, the compassion that shares the pain of a suffering person, the anger that says, this is deeply wrong and we've got to right it. Now to normative questions, which of course I've started to pose already in this last section. So I've suggested, along with Aristotle and Mill, that the Benthamite conception does not adequately capture the complexity of our concepts of pleasure and happiness, nor does the focus on overall life satisfaction have the conceptual clarity that is imputed to it. However, Benthamism captures something, whether or not that something is coincident with our reflective concepts of pleasure and happiness. So let's now ask whether that something is a good guide to public policy. Should we seek to promote pleasant feelings and minimize painful feelings? I've already suggested some reasons for doubt. So first, bad pleasures, good pains. Let's stipulate for the sake of argument that Bentham's correct. Pleasure is a single uniform sensation, even if it is produced by activities and objects of many kinds. Nonetheless, it still seems problematic to conclude, as Bentham quickly does, that pleasure is the single thing that we should be aiming to maximize. First of all, even if pleasure were single and homogeneous, a good life for a human being is clearly not single. As Mill and Aristotle argue, it is constituted by activities of many different sorts, which cannot be rendered commensurable on a quantitative scale. Already, then, there's something very important about the good life that Benthamism leaves out. But there's an even greater problem. Pleasure is simply not normatively reliable, for reasons that we've already anticipated in talking about positive and negative emotions. Some pleasures are bad, namely those that are closely associated with bad activities. Rich people have pleasure in being ever richer and lording it over other people. But this hardly shows that redistributive taxation is incorrect. Racists have pleasure in their racism, sexists in their sexism. In general, bad people tend to have pleasure in their bad behavior. The more philosophical among welfare economists have been quick to notice this problem. John Harsanyi, after excluding pleasures based upon incorrect or incomplete information from the social welfare function, feels the need to exclude as well pleasures that he calls sadistic or malicious, a notion that he unpacks further by emphasizing that he's drawing on a Kantian notion of human equality in tempering his commitment to utilitarianism. Bad pleasures for Harsanyi will be those that can insist on subordinating others and in other ways failing to respect their human dignity and equality. Analyzing Harsanyi's argument in my book, Women in Human Development, I argued that at this point, he uses independent moral notions, the notions of dignity and equality, to constrain welfarism. Thus, his view cannot be seen as a pure welfarist view. It's plausible as a guide to public policy precisely because it imports these independent moral notions and refuses to follow Bentham all the way. Another problem, which we've already encountered in talking about Wordsworth and about positive and negative emotions, is that many valuable activities are just not accompanied by pleasure. Aristotle's and Wordsworth's example was the courageous warrior, But there are many other examples of this kind, people who are striving for something and are not pausing to enjoy it. Wordsworth goes yet further. He emphasizes that the experience of risk and suffering deepens the personality, increasing compassion for others and making a person, quote, more skillful in self-knowledge, end quote. In his rhetoric discussing compassion, Aristotle agrees. He points out that people who have never faced their own weaknesses and who think optimistically that they're not very likely to suffer themselves tend to have little compassion for the sufferings of others. He calls this a hubristique diathesis, an overweening disposition. Rousseau develops this insight in Émile, talking about the kings and nobles of France, who fail in sympathy for the poor because they think that they are above the common sufferings of human life. Rousseau's proposed remedy for this problem is that education of the young should focus on the inculcation of painful emotion in the form of pitié, pity, compassionate pain at the sufferings of others. He believes it won't be easy for young Émile to learn that emotion because, like all children, he wants to feel good. But sadness must be dinned into him by repeated teaching about the common predicaments of human life, the bodily frailty we share with others, the countless other miseries to which human life is subject. This lesson is also going to be reinforced by actual suffering. So Rousseau is going to arrange that Émile's little animals will actually die, and then he'll have real pain at the deaths of these little animals. Not implausibly, Rousseau connects this teaching with ultimate happiness in the sense of flourishing life, for he thinks there can be no flourishing in a society where there's hierarchy and injustice, and there can be no justice without a common sentiment of suffering about the common human predicaments. To the extent that privileged groups have a charmed life and insulate themselves from the suffering of the poor, everyone is missing out on happiness, since they're all living in a bad world. Sponging off the misery of others may feel good, but it's not happiness for Rousseau or any of the ancient thinkers whom he follows. Rousseau's problem would appear to be very common in today's United States, no doubt to some extent in Europe as well, where people used to a high standard of living fail to consider and sympathize with the plight of those who do not enjoy such happy lives. Candace Clark's excellent sociological study of the compassion of Americans, called Misery and Company, shows that most Americans have no compassion for the poor because they're very distant from those lives and they really believe the poor are bad people who brought all their misery on themselves. Strategies are linked to diagnoses. Martin Seligman's diagnosis of Americans is that they're too anxious and unhappy, and so he proposes a public policy focused on positive emotion as a corrective, positive in his sense, good feeling emotion. An alternative diagnosis of the American psyche, which I propose, would be that many Americans can't stand to feel bad, can't stand to grieve, can't stand to look at poverty or the real damages of war. One could argue that this is a larger problem than the problem of excessive pain. Does Seligman's positive psychology risk pushing already hubristic Americans in the direction of ever greater hubris? We all have our own sense of where the deeper problems are, but here I call George Orwell to my aid. In 1984, Orwell imagines the world of the future as marred by an absence of deep pain and grief, a loss of the sense of tragedy. Tragedy, Winston perceived, belonged to the ancient time. Such things, he saw, could not happen today. Today there were fear, hatred, and pain, but no dignity of emotion or deep and complex sorrows. Now, it's a long story to show how the absence of deep grief in Oceania is connected to the politics of the novel, but let me venture to suggest that today's America is all too like Winston Smith's Oceania in that respect. We don't connect to one another in Rousseau's way through the sense of tragedy. Instead, we connect through the desire for mastery and superiority, which is all too often connected to a narcissistic indifference to the sufferings of others. Pain and loss acknowledged and thoroughly experienced, rather than pushed away or deflected into aggression, can help us grow, quote, more compassionate, more skillful in self-knowledge, end quote, as Wordsworth says. Next normative issue, adaptation. One normative worry that has already received a great deal of attention in economics and in the literature about subjective states is the phenomenon of adaptation. People's preferences adjust to what they know or expect. Amartya Sen has shown that this happens even at the level of physical health. Women who are chronically malnourished and who are taught that they have no right to demand anything following the death of a husband report their health status as good, or either good or fair, but not poor, despite the evident presence by medical exam of many diseases. Jan Elster makes the equally important point that people who are not brought up to think of themselves as equal citizens with a full range of citizens' rights will not report dissatisfaction at the absence of equality until a protest movement galvanizes their awareness. Feudalism went on for centuries without such a protest movement. Sexism went on for far longer. Empirical work on women shows that they often report satisfaction at having less education than males because that's what they were brought up to think right and proper. So, deferring to the subjective experience of pleasure or satisfaction will often bias the social inquiry in the direction of an unjust status quo. Then the last conceptual question, or normative question rather, the choice of lives. Seligman's positive psychology and the ancient Greek tradition, along with their heir John Stuart Mill, agree in a limited normative criticism of Benthamism. Namely, they agree that a life with feeling alone and no action is impoverished. So they agree that a person who sits around doing nothing or even just counting blades of grass, or a person plugged into Nozick's experience machine, is not living a life of the sort that we should try to promote in society, however pleased that person feels. But there are many further questions once one gets clear about that. First of all, I'm not even sure that Seligman has taken a position on the Mill claim that it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. He clearly thinks it's better to be Socrates satisfied than the pig satisfied, but Socrates probably had few good-feeling emotions and substantial pain. So what should we say about that comparison and the choices of lives that we might make or promote in society after thinking about it? What I'm interested in, though, is a slightly different question, absolutely central to the Greeks and Romans and to their classifications of virtues, and on which they disagree a good deal. There are quite a few types of worthwhile action. Some of them are riskier than others. Should one then choose a career that minimizes the risk of reversal and suffering? And should one urge others to choose such lives? If that aim makes sense, they all agree, then one will probably choose some kind of contemplative life. Contemplation is something that one can do under more or less any and all circumstances. In prison, if you're poor, if you have no friends, if all your children have died, you can still do it. Other sorts of lives require more specialized external conditions. A life of political action, for example, requires free birth, citizenship, friends, and at least some money. The life of a person who cares for family will be blasted if they all die, or if you prove to not get a family in the first place. So, should one rank those lives below the contemplative life? Now, the Greeks exaggerate here, of course, about the non-riskiness of contemplation. Aristotle, taking issue with the familiar picture, notes that it's ridiculous to suppose that someone who's being tortured on the rack could go on thinking well. And so the picture of the sage thinking high-minded thoughts while being tortured has something ridiculous and unrealistic about it. But still, they have a point, which I'll make with an example, a real-life example. In 1996, I had occasion to spend some time at St. Andrews University in Scotland. I was therefore involved in their commencement exercises and their honorary degree ceremonies, and I met the people who were being honored. The two men I shall contrast. They were both being honored. Clearly, both had had worthwhile lives, worthy of public honor, and they were receiving that honor. But they were very differently placed with respect to good feeling, emotion, and happiness. As they stood side by side on the stage, and as I later talked to them at various garden parties, I ruminated on that difference. One of the men was John Le Carré, who goes by the real-life name of David Cornwell. David Cornwell, who will celebrate his 80th birthday in a few months, is a very happy man in the Benthamite sense. He's relaxed and genial, gentle, funny, feels pleased. It was clear not only that he felt proud of his achievement, but also that he felt fully in control of his ongoing activity. He loves writing. Indeed, he's lived for 40 years in a remote spot in Cornwall, and he rarely travels, so that he can write all the time. And nothing and nobody disturbs him. He has a lovely wife who is also genial and funny, and he clearly enjoys her company and that of his books. Of course, illness and death will disrupt that happiness eventually, but in 1996, he was the very image of the contemplative life and its rich human satisfactions. And today, as he nears 80, he seems to be living exactly the same life, productive and calm. Side by side with him on the podium was John Hume, the Northern Irish politician who won the Nobel Peace Prize with David Trimble in 1998, so 2 years after this event. In 1996, however, there was no peace. Things were going extremely badly, and it was plausible to think that everything Hume had worked for all his life had gone out the window. He had even been sacked by his own party. John Hume was not feeling pleased. His face was like a tragic mask. He hardly spoke a word. He stood around at the garden parties as if he had no idea where he was. He stood up on the stage to be honored, but with his shoulders slumped and no glint of pleasure in his face. And when you think about his life, consider that he might have died the next day, before things began to go better, before the Nobel Prize, before his lauded retirement from politics in 2004, at which time he was praised even by Ian Paisley, before this year's astonishing vote in a public poll that named him the greatest Irish politician of all time. That's really what the ancient debate is all about. Should one pay attention to the risk of ending up in a miserable condition, all one's projects smashed, when one makes one's choice of lives? Or should one focus only on the values and commitments one believes important and follow those, whatever risk they entail? The ancient thinkers did not believe that it was optional which valuable goals one pursued. So the ones who believed that politics is an essential part of the human good thought that its riskiness was no good argument against it. One has an obligation to pursue it, come what may. It's very moving, again, to read Cicero's letters on that point, for he repeatedly says that in losing his daughter and the Roman Republic, he has lost the two things that are most important in life, and yet he continues to fight tirelessly to restore the Republic, and indeed, shortly after, he lost his life to assassination in that attempt. Benthamism, of course, gives utterly different advice. Follow the pleasant and avoid the painful. Although, as Mill observes, if one takes seriously the fact that the good is not just one's own utility, but the greatest utility of the greatest number, then one will be bound to notice that in the present defective condition of society, the person who pursues that goal, that is total utility, energetically is in for a lot of pain. Mill thinks that in a good society that would not be so, that the two would be somehow reconciled, but that in our present defective society, the good person should make the risky choice. That, however, is Mill, and a contemporary Benthamism has no such altruistic thoughts, so far as I can see, and no such critical diagnosis of our social condition as defective to the extent that individual and universal well-being are badly aligned. So, while I enjoyed the company of David Cornwell more than that of John Hume, and while I found in David Cornwell a kindred, contemplative, pleasant, pleased-feeling spirit, I admired John Hume more and criticized myself for not being more like him. Similarly, when I'm in India working with development activists, I often feel awed and humbled by them because they are out there in the trenches, risking bodily illness, risking putting contentment at risk, and life itself, while I'm sitting in a beautiful building at a new computer writing. One of India's most admired activists for women's issues, the creative NGO leader V.G. Srinivasan, died in her late 50s of respiratory collapse on a train bound from Delhi to Chennai because the harsh conditions in which she worked running a women's organization in rural Bihar had ruined her health. I have not made such choices. Indeed, whenever I travel, as everyone knows, I ask for time to go to the gym, and I want to preserve my health. So I think, of course, my excuse is that I'd be very bad at what they do and that what I do may make its own contribution to the pursuit of social justice. But it's an uneasy excuse, and I honor them for their choices. Public policy should create, honor commitments that are in their very nature fraught with risk, pain, and difficulty, especially commitments to fighting for social justice, as not optional, but mandatory parts in some form of the good life for any human being. A society that thinks this way will make different policy choices. It will favor, for example, as I do, a program of mandatory national service for all young people, in which they will all learn to teach in rural schools, to care for elderly people, and to do other valuable but unpleasant tasks. Young people in America are encouraged instead to follow pleasure and to avoid the risk of unhappiness. In fact, national service could not get probably a single vote in the US Senate, although in some sense it's urgently needed. To the extent that such recommendations are successful, our country is the poorer. But now finally to what I call the truth in subjective state analysis. So, what then? When then is it right to focus on subjective states of pleasure in the light of all these normative difficulties? Here we should turn again to Mill. Mill, out of his long experience of depression, even while he was virtuously active, as he reports, articulates a version of Aristotelianism that is, to my mind, slightly ahead of Wordsworth's and maybe even of Aristotle's. Wordsworth focuses so much on the activity that he suggests that subjective feelings of pleasure don't matter at all. In his autobiography, Mill describes himself during his depression as still active in connection with a variety of good purposes, and yet his life, he says, felt empty and meaningless. He was like a stick or a stone. Only the nourishment of poetry, prominently including Wordsworth's poetry, lifted him out of his torpor. Shortly after that, he met the love of his life, Harriet Taylor. We should pay attention to Mill's story and realize that it is important to treat depression, whether or not the treatment contributes to enhancing valuable activities. And of course, usually it does. Subjective states matter, and sometimes we can produce them through direct interventions, even though, by and large, pleasures are closely associated with activity. Public policy should certainly adopt the treatment of depression as a valuable goal, and it would not do so if it followed purely Wordsworthian lines. Indeed, my capabilities list makes room for this, making the opportunity for pleasure, and at least of some sorts, and the relief of pain a central entitlement. Public policy should also focus on the mitigation of the sort of pain that is not an enrichment of or a deepening of self-knowledge. And there's a lot of pain that is not conducive to anything good. If we can totally eliminate hunger and painful childhood diseases, we certainly should do that. We should also strive to eliminate child sexual abuse, domestic violence, and rape, all of which are pains that seem to have no positive educative function. When people have a painful illness that can't be cured, palliative treatment should be supported by a decent scheme of national medical insurance, and this same decent scheme should adequately cover the treatment of depression and other mental illnesses, as most US insurance policies do not. The badness of pain should be a central consideration in end-of-life care and in the discussion of physician-assisted suicide. Beyond this, however, there are a few other good normative recommendations made by subjective state analysts, particularly Dolan and White. Dolan and White make sensible recommendations in the area of curtailing environmental pains, such as noise pollution. We can add that nuisance law, as it has evolved, is a sophisticated set of strategies for dealing with the distress that people may cause to other people without direct harm, and such laws have a valuable social purpose. To endorse these proposals, we do not need to be Benthamites, and we certainly don't need to equate pleasure with the flourishing life. Indeed, we had better not be Benthamites, or else we're likely to use such insights in ways that dangerously subordinate and oppress. To some people, the distress caused by the presence of a homosexual couple next door is just as acute as the distress caused by the presence next door of a running sewer or some other source of environmental pollution. The law, however, has learned to distinguish between an actual physical distress directly caused by a bad smell or a bad noise, and the type of distress that is mediated by what Mill calls a purely constructive injury, that is, merely imagining what people are doing behind closed doors. For Bentham, there's no such difference. Pleasures and pains vary only in intensity and duration. So, if we're to use the insight that Dolan and White provide us, and centrally the insight that Mill's autobiography provides us, we had better have more adequate conceptions of pleasure and pain than Bentham did, and we had better have a firm grasp on moral distinctions, such as the distinction between self-regarding and other-regarding action that Mill makes central in On Liberty, that are independent of pleasure and pain, and whose protection, indeed, has always proven painful to nosy people, which is to say, most of the people who are around most of the time. In short, the appeal to subjective well-being, as currently used in the psychological literature, is not useless, but at present it's so riddled